in 2019, the first time capsule buried by Stumpy Sanderson and his gang of mischievous working-class boys, and which was actually an old Watney's Party 7 can, was unearthed. Then in 2023, the second time capsule, which was an old Courage Jackpot Bitter Party can, was discovered. And now, Whistling 5 Anarchic Productions, in conjunction with the 1970s Cigarette Appreciation Club and Puffer Patterson's Benevolent Fund for Aging Thespians, proudly presents Series 2 of Stumpy Sanderson's 1970s stories, and the 22 stories found in that second time capsule. As narrated by Andrew Brammer. Bonjour, bon après-midi, et bonsoir. The story you are about to hear is narrated in the first person, because I, just like Stumpy, witnessed firsthand the momentous events which it describes. So, let's park up the rally chopper, dim the lava lamp, switch off that episode of Catweasel, finish up the plate of Vesta beef curry, crack open a can of Double Diamond, light up a mannequin cigar, and kick back, sit back, and listen in to the anarchic and outrageous japes, scrapes and capers of Stumpy Sanderson and his gang. For this episode, we go back to 1977 for A Bite to Remember. As well as being our school's greatest euphonium player, Chutney Barton, the boy with a blowfish face, gobstopper eyes, and thick carpet of blonde hair, was also as well known for his bringing into school of his mum's piquant and potent homemade chutneys, which Chutney Barton generously spread over his packed lunch of spam or pork luncheon meat sandwiches. Some of these chutneys packed such a fiery punch that whenever Stumpy and I had been invited to take a trial bite, we found them to be far spicier and hotter than anything we had ever encountered. Our most exotic food to date having been packet-dried Vesta beef curries. And at upper school, Chutney Barton, by now growing accustomed to increasingly hotter chutneys which he asked his mum to make, took to comparing bon viveur notes on the world of spices with Gusty Burton, he of the ice cream cone hairstyle, and who had quickly become one of our gang's most trusted allies and accomplices, as well as being the drummer in mine and Stumpy's punk band. Now, Gusty, whose mum came from Hyderabad, brought in for his packed lunches her specialist samosas, containing explosive and fiery cinders, so hot that they were almost atomic, and on each of the very few occasions Stumpy and I had dared to try one of these samosas had almost blown our heads off, but Chutney and Gusty relished and radiated in their world of heat, and in both their mums rising to the enduring challenge of trying to create ever hotter chutneys and samosas for their spice-loving sons. But one lunchtime, there was also someone else who took an interest and liking to these foodstuffs. Boaster Hawkins, that tall and imposing, bragging, swaggering and crowing rooster with an oversized Goliath's head, topped off with greased back hair. Stumpy and I had long form with Hawkins, and had on more than one occasion attempted to bring him down a peg in front of his many fawning acolytes. For we could not stand his sheer arrogance, and his constant boasting and crowing about his talents and achievements in cricket, tennis, football, high jump, basketball, cross-country, and indeed any sport he tried his hand at. Out of school he dressed like the square he was, like an American jock to our urban punk rock street look. And it was Hawkins's arrogant bragging that had led to his interest in Chutney and Gusty's packed lunches. For one lunchtime, after finishing his own school lunch, and as usual surrounded by his usual bunch of flatterers and acolytes, including the fawning Sandra Cassidy and Julie Dimlock, he was making his way past our packed lunch table, when he suddenly overheard and took an immediate interest in a particularly hot new samosa which Gusty and Chutney were comparing gourmet notes on, and which had caused them both to be fanning their hands in front of their mouths as they exclaimed loudly, "Wow, that's dynamite! That's got some kick to it! That's got to be the hottest samosa to date!" "What do we have here then? What's that I heard you pair of galloping gourmets say about that being the hottest samosa?" sneered Hawkins. "Kid stuff. Let me take a bite of that." And before Gusty could pull the half-bitten large samosa away, Hawkins lowered his great head and with a shark's bite bit off almost all its remains. With a few chews, followed by an exaggerated gulping swallow, Hawkins then wiped the crumbs from his mouth with the back of his hand, and with his horrible piano-key grin, openly mocked Gusty and Chutney. "Call that hot, you pair of delicates? I've eaten hotter spangles." And at this cutting wit, Sandra Cassidy and Julie Dimlock both burst out laughing together, with the other 4 or 5 Hawkins followers, and they continued on their way out of the dining hall like some corrupt Tudor king with his retinue. We were amazed. Very few others could tolerate the heat of Gusty's or Chutney's foodstuffs, but it was typical that of those who could, that big-head Hawkins would be one. "The arrogance of that swine is breathtaking. We need to knock him off his perch," said Stumpy. And we all nodded in agreement. But little did Stumpy or I think that the devilish plan that both Gusty and Chutney were to conceive over the next few days, and which we then executed a week later, would have such devastating and explosive consequences on the reputation and pedestal standing of Boaster Hawkins. The fiendish plan revolved around 2 essential planks. The main and most crucial one being the creation of the most potent samosa filling ever concocted by Gusty's mum, together with the most lethal chutney that Chutney's mum could bubble up in her cauldrons, and then combining these together within the pastry of a large and tempting-looking samosa. Now, while both Gusty and Chutney's mums had thought that their son's requests were simply to satiate their tastes for ever hotter spices, they were unaware that Gusty and Chutney would also be surreptitiously adding their own special ingredients to the filling mix before it was wrapped within the large samosa's form. Powders that had been respectively obtained from the art block stock cupboard and a local chemist. So, it was now lunchtime of the day of the plan's execution, and as we sat round the packed lunch table, we were all ready. Stumpy and I had learnt our scripts. Gusty and Chutney had the deadly samosa primed and ready in its lunchbox with its alchemy for its ghastly purpose. Observing Hawkins and his cronies eating their dinner over the far side of the hall, we saw them finish their sponge puddings with pink custard, and after scraping and stacking their crockery, bang on cue and with Sheila Cassidy and Julie Dimlock and a couple of his jocks in tow, Hawkins headed our way. Preparing our weapon, Gusty opened his lunchbox and handed the massive samosa with a distinctive, almost radioactive glow to Stumpy. As Hawkins approached, our trap then sprang into action, with Stumpy suddenly holding up the samosa for all to see and exclaiming in an exceptionally loud voice, "Wow, I'm not tasting that! Not if that's the hottest thing ever made!" Immediately, like radar picking up an enemy signal, Hawkins turned his great Goliath head towards us and eyed the giant samosa in Stumpy's hand. "Well, well, well, Sanderson and his weebles. What do we have here, then?" "Clear off, Hawkins, you great lummox," I retorted. "We're discussing Gusty's and Chutney's new lethal spice filling, and even you're not man enough to eat that." "No one is." Hawkins sneered and snorted. "Oh, yeah? Just like the last feeble one I tried." And now, following his cue, Stumpy suddenly switched into his best Dirty Harry voice. I know what you're thinking. Is this a hot spice, or are they bluffing? But to tell you the truth, I forgot myself in all this excitement. For this is the Hyderabad chutney samosa explosion, and it can blow your head clean off. It can be measured on the Richter scale, and after just one bite, you start coughing and spluttering. Your throat rasps, your eyes bulge, you start sweating. Your heart rate increases. You have a massive adrenaline rush. Yeah, I jumped in, following our script to the letter. And then the nausea begins to kick in, followed by swelling of the face, stomach and limbs, heartburn, eye pain, and a splitting headache. Then gripping abdominal pains as you collapse, writhing to the floor. Stumpy finished our lines. So, you gotta ask yourself, do I feel lucky? Well, do you, Hawkins? Hawkins and his grovellers looked and listened open-mouthed. Stumpy and I could not have delivered our soliloquies any better. You're bluffing, said Hawkins. That's rubbish. And then Stumpy threw down the gauntlet. Why not try it then, if you're man enough? Hawkins pondered, the look on his face betraying the fact that even he was having his doubts as to whether we were indeed bluffing. But then, unable to resist the challenge, he leaned forward, lowered his monstrous head, and with his oversized teeth took a huge slobbering bite from the samosa. It only took a few split seconds for Hawkins to realise we hadn't been bluffing, for as soon as he chewed into the samosa and the burning and molten filling hit his mouth, he instantaneously started making the most horrendous gasping and blowing sounds. Whoa! Whoa! But, determined to prove his machismo, and even though the deadly samosa was causing his mouth red-hot discomfort, he was determined to finish chewing and then swallow the huge portion he had bitten off. As he did so, and now frantically fanning his mouth to try to alleviate the heat, his face already growing a definite shade of crimson, and his head looking like, with the heat, it was somehow expanding to an even bigger size than normal, he never said another word, eyed us with furious contempt, and then, with his concerned-looking followers in tow, proceeded to make his way to the dining hall exit, strutting as usual, and trying to pretend that nothing had happened. As a fond adieu, Stumpy shouted out, "Let us know when the nausea and then all the other side effects kick in." And then a grebo, who had just stood up from one of the last tables Hawkins and his entourage were passing, gave a big thumbs up and shouted out, "Nice psychedelic teeth, man!" And a couple of prog rockers started laughing. Then we heard both Sheila Cassidy and Julie Dimlock simultaneously shriek, "Your teeth! What's happened to your teeth?" Looking bewildered and panicked, Hawkins started tonguing round his mouth, and then, as others became aware of the fuss and commotion, and were now joining in with the general pointing and laughing, Hawkins, with a look of both confusion and growing fury on his ever-reddening face, and with a couple of his courtiers in tow, raced out of the dining hall in the direction of the toilets. In the toilets, a horrified Hawkins, his huge head now definitely looking more bloated and swollen than usual, spent the first 10 minutes or so desperately trying to scrub off the hideous red, green and bright yellow colour of his teeth, which now looked like a multicoloured Peshawari bus, stained not only from the special spices of the samosa, but also from the powdered permanent paint dyes which Gusty and Chutney had purloined from the art block store cupboard and had added to the potent mix. However, that dye was not labelled as permanent for nothing, and despite all Hawkins's efforts, it would remain in its full multicoloured glory on his teeth for the next 10 days, making him a hilarious laughingstock. The worst side effects of the samosa, though, kicked in after those initial 10 minutes, when the full effect of the laxative powder which Chutney and Gusty had obtained from that local chemist, and had also added to the spice mix, unleashed its full force, and Boaster Hawkins was condemned to spend the rest of the afternoon in those toilets, the resulting explosions from which some swore could be heard all around B Block. Thank you for listening to this episode of Stumpy Sanderson's 1970s Stories. And please don't forget to check out the other stories from Series 2 and Series 1. You can also follow Stumpy Sanderson's 1970s Stories on Facebook, where you can keep up to date with all the news about live shows and other Stumpy events. There's also the website, www.stumpysanderson.co.uk, and the Stumpy Sanderson's 1970s Stories YouTube channel. And you can get in touch with me at Andrew@StumpySanderson.co.uk. www.narrated.co.uk. Until the next story, au revoir et bonne nuit, and keep grooving.
Yeah. This podcast has been recorded using a DIY punk rock philosophy. Yeah.